Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for taking an identity-centric approach to a modern security architecture. I'm Kathy Cromley with SailPoint, and I'll be your host for today's event. Here are a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. Attendee phone lines will be muted to minimize background noise. We will be recording today's session, and it will be available after the event. And a Q&A will be held after the formal presentation. So let's get started. We have three industry experts with us today that I'm pleased to announce. Frank Bergoglio, Global Public Sector Strategist at SailPoint, Jerry Gable, President of Axiomatics Federal, and Chris Stewart, Senior Director of Business Development at Exabeam. Thank you, gentlemen, and now I'll turn it over to Frank to kick us off.
Thank you, Kathy. I really appreciate it. So we're going to go ahead and get started here. We're first going to discuss what's driving us. We'll take a look at the increasing risk that we have, a little background on some cybersecurity frameworks. We'll look at zero trust from the principles, and then we'll hear from each of the vendors. So to go ahead and kick off, what we're here to talk about today is really this complex situation we've got in, how we've gotten here, and really, what we can do about this new risk that we're seeing. Across the globe, commercial companies and government agencies alike have begun a digital transformation and modernization of their IT ecosystem. This means, more adoption of cloud infrastructure services at a pace we've never seen. Exponentially, we're seeing data growth, growth in users, systems. We're seeing that the traditional perimeter has been dissolving. And then comes this global pandemic that's changed the way most enterprises work today. We're working from home, as we all are probably doing today. We're accessing the crown jewels to our organizations from our home offices, potentially on our own devices, and definitely from our home networks. So I would say now that the identity is definitely the new perimeter. So what does this mean? It means, this risk that we have is growing. Across the board, we face new legislation, standards, frameworks, policies to protect critical and sensitive information. The adversary continues to become more advanced. We must protect our organizations from a broad array of threat actors with increasing complexity, resources, and persistence. This increasing number and overall impact of cybersecurity breaches is staggering when we look at some of the statistics. In 2019, 7,000 breaches were reported, resulting in more than 15 billion records exposed. That's up over 284% over 2018. As of 2019, attacks are considered the top 5 risks to global stability. And what is the target? The target is email addresses, usernames, passwords have all been the top data that's been compromised. So with these billions of identities and sensitive data compromised, it's creating a lack of confidence. Executive leadership, in another survey, 3 of 5 C-level executives expect to be breached. That's unsatisfactory, really, when we think of what are the security practitioners that should be protecting our organization. We protect critical information that will do grave harm to the business, to its employees. And in the case of government, the country, national security, more importantly, its citizens, if that data gets into the wrong hands. This information ranges from business secrets, personal identifiable information of employees, of citizens. It's proprietary or network or export controlled data, or other sensitive material related to national security or the business itself. Enterprises invest heavily in protecting this data from external actors, but the insider threat problem is also requires a new approach to access control. Our user communities are expanding. The amount of data being created, as I mentioned, is growing exponentially. And it's no longer to protect this data or these sensitive assets behind a single network wall. And it's the fast path for the threat actor to steal data is through a compromised identity. So when we look at risk, threat, complexity, it makes all of this really hard to manage. Just a couple other statistics. In another survey, the top security concerns were, insider breaches, negligent data breaches. Well, what does that mean? That means misconfigured system, misappropriated entitlements. Also malicious intent by bad actors. So what this shows us, the perimeter is dead, and the identity is most definitely that new attack vector. So, there's an identity-centric approach to modern security architecture. It's going to help protect the organization and the weapons that are being used against us today. It's the identity itself. And the other aspect of this is cybersecurity frameworks. So whether we're talking about ISO, NIST, HIPAA, GDPR, CCPA, PCI, all of these security frameworks require a system of interconnected components working together to efficiently and confidently grant appropriate policy-driven access and identify known and unknown threats to prevent or limit the damage done by nefarious actors. And we're going to take a look at how the NIST cybersecurity framework and identity kind of go hand in hand. When we look at this and look at how identity applies, the first step in the NIST cybersecurity framework is identify. And that really is creating this comprehensive view of enterprise systems, people, assets, and data. It's establishing that baseline of what access should look like and what identities look like, and it establishes the relationship or context to identity data. And that goes further into how the identity ecosystem shares that. And that's really what we're all about today, is how we share this identity data across an identity-centric ecosystem. So when we get into the cybersecurity frameworks, when we look at the security controls around protecting data and resources, identity governance and identity access really gives us this model-based approach to how we ensure access is authorized and appropriate. And then also allows us to detect, since we've established that baseline, it allows us to detect the nefarious activities or risky behaviors over entitled users, things of that nature that present more of this risk. Cybersecurity frameworks also have this concept of responding once we've detected something. And, that's why we have our friends here from Exabeam today. Identity itself provides that rich contextual access, and Axiomatics enforces this through this metadata, enforces access. But on the, in that security event analysis, right, identity is enriching those security events with really, who is that person? What else do they have access to? Do they pose any additional risk? And then to close it all, really to respond is, or recover is the business process, the automation of workflows to move on once an event has occurred. But really, there's over 35 areas, like in the NIST cybersecurity framework, where identity itself actually applies. So it's a critical piece of the cybersecurity framework. The other thing is this modern security architecture. We've heard this for quite some time. Zero trust has been around, but it's getting a resurgence. And in order to achieve a zero trust type architecture, what I like to call identity-centric or modern security, excuse me, it requires integrating identity and security technologies together to address specific requirements. Access is just a piece of the puzzle. There's broader initiatives such as insider threat also that requires this identity-centric approach as well, to ensure that we're optimally granting access and we're providing real-time intelligence. So when we start looking at the components of Zero Trust, it's this paradigm shift from perimeter-based security to identity-based security. It's a new model of access. There's no perimeter, right? We're looking at this from the identity perspective. So we need to understand our data and how we're going to protect that data in the context we need. We need to enforce least privilege model of access. That doesn't mean zero access. It means enough access to get started. But we need to make that frictionless to grant additional access, and that's things like using contextual factors to balance that usability and security. So it's that metadata about me that can be used in an access policy or in a compliance policy as well. It's the analytics that understand that we're using to detect threats and breaches. So it's our ability to move on. All of this together really creates this model of identity-centric security. And when we look at this, I like to talk to this slide a little bit. As identities finally transition from this operational and user experience driven to being recognized as the core of security. One thing I like to remind folks is that it's a team sport. There are stakeholders across the organization and a multitude of vendor technologies, and there is no silver bullet. Organizations often struggle to make sense of these complex security technologies. That's why we're here today, to help you, to help curb that hunger that organizations have for new approaches to solve complex challenges and improve overall security. And extract the value out of the business investments that you've already made. So SailPoint brings together to the table today the concept of identity governance, Axiomatics, that piece of the access management, and then Exabeam rounding it out and keeping us all honest with the analytics and control of how we do this. So we're now going to explore the power of data-driven identity ecosystem that meets the demands of this digital transformation, modernization, in our new complex environments that we have. We're going to discuss how the identity is a critical component of modern security ecosystem. We'll dive into the SailPoint platform a little bit and talk about lifecycle automation and modeling and least privilege access. We'll look at access and attribute-based access control, and how all this comes together when integrated with a SIEM UEBA platform, how the combined identity context controls and policies deliver that powerful threat detection, incident response, and investigation. So to go ahead and get us started, I'm going to talk a little bit about identity governance. At SailPoint, we've been saying identity is the new perimeter for quite some time. It's the center of security. As I already mentioned, identity governance establishes the baseline of what access should look like and the relationship and context across all user type objects. So employees, non-employees, contractors, service accounts, RPAs, bots, for all infrastructure, whether it's systems, applications, cloud, data. It provides the in-depth detail into who should have access, who currently has access, how access was granted, is it still acceptable, is it still suitable, and what is being done with the access. So when we look a little deeper into identity governance and what identity governance provides this functionality to deliver that frictionless access and complete visibility through the implementation of your business processes and your workflows through synchronization and automation. We commonly call this that day one access. And then the joiner, mover, leaver process modifies that access when something changes about me. Identity governance enforces the model of access that we've created to meet our compliance frameworks. Could be based on roles, policies, risk. It provides that continuous evaluation of least privileged access and separation of duties to prevent things like entitlement creep and orphaned accounts. We provide the out-of-band controls and analytics to identify unauthorized changes to native systems, determine outliers and recommendations based on machine learning and artificial intelligence to give approvers a better yes, no approach to reviewing access or approving access. It provides that a structured methodology to review and recertify access to reduce compliance fatigue, and provides detailed reports, on identities, risk, compliance, all in consumable formats, whether we're sharing that context out to our technology partners, as we're doing here today, or whether it's an actual consumer of the data itself. So just a little bit about what SailPoint delivers. We have this innovative approach to securing access across the enterprise with our predictive identity platform. The platform's designed to securely accelerate the mission objectives through automation as much as we can, while delivering this adaptive security model and continuous compliance. Like I said, it provides that comprehensive view of access to all resources, whether we're talking multi-cloud, on-premise, it doesn't matter. We're providing through our services, the analytics to make those informed access decisions, identify risk, like I said, enforce the policies. So we're a modular-based platform that grows within organizations' maturity model itself as you move through security. We connect and integrate with virtually any application or system and file storage, found in your environment. So as I said, ensuring all users, including bots, only have the access they need to get their job done. Compliance manager, lifecycle manager, file access manager provide the governance capabilities, including things like provisioning, access requests, certification, separation of duty, and that governance of structured and unstructured data. So we can couple these SailPoint identity services with the platform to unleash the capabilities that will help organizations see and do more, and that's the access insights that we provide, the access modeling, the recommendations. This helps organizations create and update roles, policies to shape the access ecosystem within the environment. These tools can learn and adapt to your needs. So we're getting to that autonomous identity where access should change based on how access is being used. Access should change based on things about me. So when we're looking at using our access modeling and our access insights, looking at peer group analysis, for example, if we find these outliers, we should be able to fill the gaps in our security holes, if any are found, or tighten up our role modeling. If the organization, if your organization is relying on AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, our cloud access management platform and privilege workload goes deep into the objects, the workload that you have in the cloud, and gives you the visibility to control and that you need to protect these resources. All of this is possible through our alliance program And the reason, you know, we're able to integrate with folks like Axiomatics and Exabeam here is that we provide an open identity platform that connects, integrates with virtually everything, as I mentioned. And this formal process that we've established, our Alliance Plus program for technology partners, enables the seamless integration without addition or impact to the customer. So we're providing these connections, we're providing plugins and APIs and connectors so that we can quickly drive value in your security ecosystem. We have over 100 integration modules and connectors that go broad and deep across your applications. This is just a quick view of that. And today we're going to specifically look at the benefits of integrating with you know, as I've said, Axiomatics and Exabeam. That's why we're here. So we're going to look at access management and security information and behavior analytics a little more closely. So when we think of Axiomatics doing attribute-based access control, the benefit of integrating with the identity governance solution is that we're providing Axiomatics who's using these attributes in decision making in their policy decision point, policy enforcement point. We're ensuring that the attributes are accurate. They've been reviewed. There's confidence. There's accuracy of the metadata. It might be roles. It might be contextual attributes, such as cyber awareness training or role-based training. It could be information about my background or identity proofing. It could be a location or a job title. But the idea is we're ensuring that this data is accurate. So when it comes to an automated decision based on an access policy, we're letting the folks through the door that should be let through the door, and we're preventing those that don't meet those policy requirements. And then when it comes to integrating with Exabeam, you know, one of the things that we do is we provide data to populate the watch list. And Chris will explain this a little bit more. But, you know, we can send Exabeam context or metadata for overexposed entitlements, overexposed users, risky users, contractors that are departing in less than 30 days, for example. We can classify the users, those users that have access to sensitive data or privileged accounts. This allows us to also flip that on its head and do automated response and remediation where necessary, you know, or disabling accounts when Exabeam determines that nefarious activity is detected. So before I take up any more time, we definitely want to get on to the next slides and the next part of the presentation. Jerry, take it away.
All right, Frank, thanks very much. And thanks for setting the table there. And I wanted to extend some of the points you've been making from that access and authorization perspective. So many years ago, Mark Andreessen said, you know, software is eating the world. Every company is going to be a software company. And I think that certainly turned out to be true, even though it's so easy for organizations to purchase a SaaS application. There's still so much application development going on across the private sector and commercial and public sector organizations. And part of what's happening, of course, as you mentioned, is that journey to the cloud. But not only are we seeing a hybrid scenario evolving where it's quite normal for some amount of data or applications to remain on-premise in your own data center, and then others, you know, newer development in a cloud environment. We're seeing that multi-cloud environment develop as well that you referenced a few moments ago. And for those that are building applications, of course, the developer trends are all around APIs and microservices. And you know, we're certainly here, part of what we're here to do is to encourage those developers to embrace a cleaner architecture where they can separate that security logic from those new development efforts that they're making today and not repeat some of the maybe less than desirable practices of the past. And of course, from a compliance perspective, I think the three organizations here today will talk to the point of closing that compliance loop and really providing a better, more comprehensive view of compliance, because we do have so much more data, so many more users and types of users that we are dealing with. So can we really tell who has access to what, and can we thoroughly review what has happened in the past? And while Axiomatics is a software vendor specializing in access technology, there's this business perspective that we need to keep in mind as well, and it can have very different viewpoints depending on where you sit in the organization. Of course, the digital transformation department or people in the organization that are focused on that want to make sure that while they innovate, they're also secure. And those are the digital officers or the chief data officers, the enterprise architects that are focused on this aspect. And then the CISO department is always overseeing how the organization is secure or not, developing those procedures and practices as we move to this cloud or hybrid environment. And then of course, risk managers. Frank, you talked a lot about risk and managing risk. And so we want to know what is our exposure as we evolve the infrastructure and the software and the capabilities that we're offering both internally as well as to external constituents. And then of course, lastly, the development shop. They want, they have agile practices, DevOps practices. They don't want to be slowed down by compliance and security and risk management. They want the ability to move as fast as the business. And we're seeing more and more of them adopt a DevSecOps model where they can incorporate security into that agile development process. So Frank, you mentioned attribute-based access control, or ABAC, previously. So what do we really mean by this? Well, you did talk about context, and that's a great aspect to expand on here, and also about policies. So it's really a combination of policies and attributes. The policies define the boundaries, the rules of where access is permitted or denied. It's really a concept of least privilege in another definition. I'd like to say it's precise privilege because we can define exactly who has access to what data and other resources. And from the attributes perspective, while identity is supremely important, it's not the only contextual attribute that you can incorporate into a policy definition or the runtime evaluation, because you can incorporate almost any other characteristic about the user or the situation. What device are they using? Has it been issued by the organization? Or if it's a BYOD, it's your own device, has it been managed by the corporate mobile device system, so we know it's up to date with its patches and so on? Is there a time of day component or location component? There could be issues with intellectual property across borders where I need to know where you are right now based on the access attempt you're making. And even what is your relationship to the data? Is it in the same department that you are in? Is this data object, maybe this patient or customer, are they directly assigned to you? So you can incorporate all of these aspects into the attribute-based access model to really refine who has access to what. And what's so important is that attribute data and the need for an authoritative source of, as Frank's mentioned, accurate data, up-to-date data, information about those users, their department, the roles they are assigned to, the groups they are members of, their department, their clearance. All of these things can be incorporated into policies within the Axiomatics framework. And this information can be loaded into the dictionary that Axiomatics implements on its platform, so that we have a common definition of these attributes, their name, their type, potentially even constraints of what are the allowed values for each one, so that the people who are managing the governance lifecycle and the people who are implementing access control policies can basically operate from the same sheet of music. It's incredibly important to make things efficient and really limit the opportunity for gaps in the environment. And then when this is actually implemented, where can this ABAC system be deployed? Well, it really can cover a wide range of the different types of resources or applications in your environment, whether they're deployed on-prem, in the cloud, or in a hybrid configuration. So everything from the web single sign-on level or portals, of course, to APIs and microservices, and even to the data level, so that you have fewer places where you're defining access policies. You have a central place where you can manage the configuration and properly do change control. Having a common authorization policy framework for all of these different kinds of resources gives you a better ability to report and determine what can or what has happened in the environment. So this is, and of course, the audit trail that can be derived from a centralized system to give the analysis of this data so much richer information and context. And Chris will be talking about that in a moment. So what if we don't implement this kind of infrastructure service? Well, then you go back to maybe what I described earlier, is those less than desirable practices of incorporating this security access logic into the application. So building it into the new APIs and microservices. And then what happens is now that logic is hidden from the audit system in many cases, hidden somewhat from compliance and governance. So if it's not totally hidden, certainly makes those processes more difficult. So what we're trying to do is extract this functionality, implement it in a shared infrastructure service, so we can have the clearer and more visible reporting and the transparency. I think that's so important as our environments get so much more complex. And speaking of those audit logs, from the authorization service, there is an incredible amount of data that's generated at runtime. So all of the incoming requests for access to different kinds of resources are processed against those policies that I mentioned earlier. So you get the incoming request, you get identifiers of all the policies that were evaluated against that request. Of course, you have the subject ID of the user, so you can track that across different resources and activities. You have all of the other attribute data that was used to evaluate that access request. So it gives you another chance to confirm that whether that data is correct or not. And then, of course, the result was that this a permit or deny kind of evaluation. And all of this data is redirected to Exabeam, and Chris will be talking about the incredible things that they can do with correlating and analyzing this data. And in addition to the runtime access attempts that are processed here, even the administrative console and those functions also generate an audit log. So you know which administrator changed a policy or changed a configuration, activated a policy or deactivated one. So you have not only the runtime of the user activity, but even the activity of the administrators in the environment. So going back to the integrated solution benefit slide here, just wanted to point out a couple other things. One is on the context here, and Chris will be talking about this. I think this really enables us to provide a more clear view, a more realistic view of the risk exposure and this sort of mitigation that maybe we need to take based on that rich information. And then on the automation side, being able to forward these logs to Exabeam and how they can process that against, for example, the watch list and the high-risk users that Frank mentioned SailPoint is identifying, it really gives us the ability to act automatically when certain conditions or thresholds are met. And with those changes being made, say in SailPoint to deactivate a user, or in Exabeam to raise the risk score of a particular user or location, that can automatically be incorporated into future access evaluation. So it's an incredibly powerful combination when the systems are working in cohesion like that. So Chris, I think we're going to tee it up for you now to take it over from here to our Q&A session. And I see there's already some questions being posted, so encourage you to do that, and we'll get to those shortly. Over to you, Chris.
Great, thanks, Jerry, and thanks, Frank, as well. Really appreciate, oh, I think someone accidentally clicked on it here. Let me click back and get us back to our screen. Just one sec. Okay. Small technical difficulties. So thanks again, and appreciate the opportunity to get together with friends from both SailPoint and Axiomatics to talk about, really the world of identity and security and how the two of them really need to come together. So I'm going to actually take a slightly different approach going forward for the next few minutes. I'm going to talk about the current state of security from a macro view. So what are the challenges that security teams and organizations and businesses, government organizations are facing? So what are the challenges? What are the reality? And hopefully, as we go forward and in this big data-driven world, what is the future of that? And how can we build systems that really help us as businesses and government entities and enterprises really build for the future? So I'd like to welcome you to, let's just see. Oops, sorry. I'd like to hold on here. There's a bit of a lag on my screen. Apologies for that. So this is what unfortunately security professionals are facing every day. I'm going to talk about a few of the challenges first. So really there's quite a lot of noise and quite a lot of vendors. Now, a lot of technology in this screen is great technology, and it's really difficult for security professionals and teams to determine, well, what does my all-star team need to look like? What do I need? So it's bad enough I have to deal with all these adversaries coming at me. What do I do? How do I equip my squad, my SEAL team to really pull together the various technologies and services I need to really be protecting and a good custodian of my enterprise and build a great security strategy around that? So obviously we're working together with our friends at SailPoint and Axiomatics to help you with that particular situation. So all that technology, what does that equal for our security professionals? Ultimately, as we go around the world and talk to customers and deal with chief information security officers, CIOs, line of business owners, unfortunately, it generates just a lot of stuff and a lot of work and a lot of noise. So this is really difficult for security professionals to get ahead of the game and really find the needle in the haystack. I know it's an overused term, but really the pile of paper is just getting bigger, the virtual pile of paper in our world. Is it best to be querying and pivoting in the old school, SIM and security way, screen to screen? Is that really an effective way? Really people are digging through these piles of information, hoping that they find something. Hope, as we all know, is not a strategy, as a former senior executive leader mentor of mine always used to say. Really, and what this is causing in security teams, as we work around the world again, is just an overwhelming state of inefficiency and just really a bunch of people that are having trouble getting to the surface to breathe fresh air. So the security teams are very overwhelmed, and that's typically one of the problems we see from an overload in technology. Another industry challenge we find is also things that can be easily remedied, or at least we think easily remedied with some of the go-forward solutions. So part of the problem is what am I licensed to see? So it might be a little bit strange to hear that in fact, some enterprises don't actually look at all the data that they have running through their veins in their business simply because they're not licensed for it. That needs to change. All that first slide that showed all the vendors, all those vendors are generating good data in some respect. It behooves you to look at that data and look at it in concert with all the other data, and I'm going to talk a bit about that in a moment. Now, the data that enterprises are looking at, there's this alert fatigue. It's totally unmanageable. The amount of alerts and red flags that pop up in a daytime really makes people numb to the overall cause. And then really germane to today's discussion is, malicious activity. One user's malicious activity could actually be theoretically someone else's standards. If the policies are too rigid, they're not flexible and nimble and based on things like machine learning and also context awareness, how do you know what you're doing? And how do you know what you're preventing against is actually good? Or are we inhibiting good behavior because it might look a little bad? We're going to talk quite a bit more about that. So as we move forward, a couple of things, if you have some perspective on that. Now, if you have an unlimited budget, which none of us do, an army of top tier security analysts, which again, don't really exist, and then an automagic way to handle all breaches, then you're good to go. And unfortunately, the reality of the world is that those don't exist. So what do we do? There really probably really needs to be a better way. So let's just move ahead. A little bit of lag here. So yeah. So industries shift, and we've seen this over time, and security industry is no different. We've seen the move from legacy or first generation technologies to next generation technology, or NG. So, a little over a decade ago, we saw quite a movement in the firewall market. Companies like Palo Alto innovated and really took the static firewall and moved it into next generation application-centric and aware firewall, and really changed that marketplace for the better. Old bloated endpoint and antivirus solutions over the years, most recently, have evolved with companies like SentinelOne and CrowdStrike, have really taken the game from just been there, done that, old news information, to really front foot leading on this sprawl of the enterprise IT environment to really bring endpoint detection and response. And what we're going to talk about today in our little section is the security information event management, or SIEM, which is really the security architecture and hierarchy over all the technologies, has really graduated to next generation SIEM. Now, it's a catchy term, but really, what is the new way for security management? So I'm going to use an Exabeam slide, but really in this case, these are the three elements we believe, or the main elements, let's call it, that are really comprise the modern SIEM. These are the attributes that you need to look at, i.e., let's starting on the left-hand side of the screen. You need to be able to collect information, and all information. Frank and Jerry did talk about the information from their platforms coming in to a SIEM, and this is effectively how you do it. The SIEM needs to be able to receive all information and not be license restricted to only parts of it, because you wouldn't look at part of a crime scene. You need to look at the whole thing to determine what's going on. And also the ability to connect both to a cloud or premise or a hybrid environment is critical. So that's one element. The middle part is really where the modern SIEM has changed dramatically. No longer are we relying on correlation rules or query pivots. Really, you need to harness the power of machine learning. You need to understand that really just adding correlation rules to an ever-growing phone book is never going to get you to where you need to get to from a nimble perspective at the growth of big data and the data explosion that we're all facing. So you need to harness things like behavioral analytics by leveraging machine learning to get there. And then finally, once you determine something's gone wrong, or I would say, for instance, in this case, I've been compromised, how do we handle that response in a seamless fashion? We lean on technologies like SailPoint and Axiomatics to help basically, and pardon the term, cut the head off the snake, or eradicate the issue that is in front of us, that's infested our environment. So these are the elements that we believe make up the modern security management platform. So to sort of put a slight bow on it and understand what we're talking about, really, you need to develop things what we call smart timelines. And this really is an automatic generation of a lot of telemetry and a lot of data that sequences information along with behavior, identity, as Frank and Jerry have talked about, and then the scope, and putting this into a new information model that's incredibly easy for security operations centers, teams, and analysts to work with. I'm going to build this out because we seem to be having a little bit of lag here, but when talking about this smart timeline, what does that actually mean? When you're building a timeline in a forensic investigation, you try to piece together the beginning, middle, and end of where things happen. So in this particular case, a security management timeline would start with an incident, but that incident is only as good as the context around it. So by putting different information from different viewpoints, as you will, into that incident, you can then also learn the behavior. Is this normal or is this abnormal? And once we understand what normal is, we have the ability to identify anomalies. Once we've determined that there's an anomaly, we can add risk score. Now, the risk score is also based on the context and the previous pillars before it, so that we're not just adding static risk scores because things change. We work in a very fluid environment these days, more so than ever. So it's really important to apply contextual awareness to the issues as they happen. Again, back to the visualness, it's really, truly important to make this in a way that people can act quickly, understand what they're looking at, and act upon it. And really, the final thing is leverage the tools in your environment and they're at your disposal in this really exciting time in security to automate, to do as much of the lifting via machines as comfortable and as possible. The technology exists and it's really there to help us, really reduce the amount of permutation that these threat and bad actors and nation state bad actors can get into our environments with. So looking at it in a slightly different lens, the new way to pull data together, we see a lot of organizations pulling together either legacy data lakes or old data lakes on their own, and effectively it's dumping a lot of information into one. But really, truly, the best way to handle this swath of information is to get it into a central repo, but have the ability to leverage, again, things like machine learning to pull out the nuggets, pull out the gold, and establish those timelines that we've been talking about. Now, what does this mean to the real world? A lot of concepts and a lot of fluffy marketecture in those last couple slides, so I do apologize. Let's talk about a real customer for a moment. This is actually an Exabeam customer who presented us with this data around a day in the life of. So this was as he called it, a Tuesday in his environment over a 24-hour period. His log information that was generated over that day was just a little north of 500 million logs received, which was parsed into 250 million by Exabeam, and then 70 million events were created. So again, big numbers of data flowing in through one end of the processing pipeline. Now, at the 56,000 mark where the sessions are started, this is where typically most SIMs fall down. So in other words, this is where 56,000 users and entities start performing various actions. Now you can imagine if each one of those did one thing of high value or high risk, that's 56,000 incidents that an organization has to go in and chase. Exabeam via machine learning and also any of the new generation of technologies that leverage things like machine learning are able to process this information, and we're able to boil those 56,000 sessions and all the events that were created, the 70 million, down to 231 notable users. Now, oddly enough, this is actually high for us. This was this wasn't our this was an irregularly high day, but you get some good and you get some bad. Now out of that was determined just simply 12 tickets that a security team could actually go. They had the proof, they had the evidence chain, and they could actually go investigate and effectively work and close that. So even a single person could theoretically handle that level of work. So what do you get out of that? Incredible, massive accuracy and tremendous focus from your security team. So just to recap sort of what the modern SIM and does and how it enables security operations center teams or SOC teams, what we feel the modern SIM needs to do is aggregate all your information. Let's not decide who gets in the life raft and who does not. Let's bring in all your security information. Let's bring everything into to the party, if you will. And then let's leverage the technology that's in front of us, things like machine learning and math, to effectively dramatically, improve threat detection. Find out where the actual issues are. Don't go chase ghosts. Do not chase false positives. They're leveraging the technology that exists in the world today. You can actually point into the right direction and go and investigate. And that'll ultimately increase your analyst productivity. Now, we can only do this as Exabeam, and as mentioned by my colleagues from SailPoint and Axiomatics, if we have integrations and partnerships. So we have stressed since day one of being a company that we really do need to work with everyone in the security industry and build really strong integrations. These are customer-driven, market-driven integrations. But as you can imagine, there's some that are higher value than others, and from a security perspective anyways. And again, that's going to dovetail nicely into where this presentation is going, because there is a true convergence in the world of the world of identity, the world of access management, and of course, security. So, as mentioned, the worlds are colliding in a really great way. Now, to sort of add some proof or some third-party evidence to this, I'm going to look to Forrester for some guidance on this. And a recent document, I sincerely hope you guys get a chance to read this, the Great Enabler, around identity governance. About half of executives incorrectly saw the security and compliance as two separate issues, so not linked together, or not linked together in a serious manner. And only 28%, rather 3/4, did not look at it through a risk lens. So 3 out of 4 executives looked at compliance, but without the risk or the security consequences as it relates to not gluing those two things together. So also in the same study, there was some evidence that there were not evidence, there's some statistics that sort of helped people understand, well, where are the gaps? And this speaks very nicely to identity governance, access management. So access privileges, too much info, too much access to too many people. That's 45% of the breaches that happened came back to that. 40% were insider, bad actors internally, which is or silly actions by certain employees, but really, 4 out of 10, that's quite a high number. And then things like separation of duties and orphaned accounts, just bad hygiene and laziness, unfortunately, and not really being able to pull all that together. But nonetheless, these are all breaches that we have to, or issues that we have to deal with. So back to sort of the reason we're here, whether it be from SailPoint, from the governance and access perspective from Axiomatics, bringing the data from these very rich and very powerful data sets into either the logs or the data lake, or into the analytics engine, or log engine into the analytics engine. I've talked a lot about the middle of this diagram and the right, but as we look for really powerful data sources to help tell a better story and help security professionals and IT professionals, for that matter, tell a better story, really this is a triumvirate of real power, so that people can understand what in fact they need to act on and where they need to enhance their strategies. So just to look at one quick integration point, we have many, but this is one that we have with SailPoint. This is where we've determined a certain risky activity, will meet once it meets a certain threshold, we can then perform some form of mitigation action through the drop-down menu. And then ultimately, at the end of the day, we can schedule the activities. And this is all done out of the box and is set in policy with our friends at SailPoint. Now, we talked about our dashboard, and I think this was mentioned in when Jerry was speaking, but this is the Exabeam window pane, or this is the our control center. Everything you see in red are populated by identity governance policies, and these are things that security analysts and also identity teams can actually look at to determine, well, where's my risk? Now, everything you see that's not in a red box, those are our typical ones, like notable users, their score exceeds 90, or account lockouts, executive users, people are subject to whale phishing. But then when you look at SailPoint disabled users, well, there's one that does cross over there. So the intent of this is to show the integration and the convergence of the identity access and management world and the identity governance world within security. This really does need to happen, and we have many customers looking on the front foot of this and looking to put these technologies and these practices, remove the silo, and really work together on it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn it over for the last minute or two to Jerry and Frank to maybe talk about some of the different ways that they've seen customers, or some of the issues that they've run into with some customers where they're trying to roll things out, because we want to be flexible. And we want to make sure that we have the ability to work within anyone's environment as needed.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris and Frank. So did you want to talk more about this slide, Chris, before we try to take a couple of questions from the audience?
Yeah, absolutely, no problem. What we're trying to represent in this, and again, unfortunately, we're running short on time. We could talk all day on something like this, but one of the things that was touched on earlier is where data resides and where people need to access it from has changed. Obviously, COVID-19 has really changed the world as we know it. But really, the movement to the cloud, and then obviously there is legacy architectures with data centers. They're not going anywhere anytime soon. But as we look at where people are accessing and things like lifecycle management, and also just the need to put good hygiene around who gets what, and then the ability to enforce policies within both a standard identity governance access framework into a security measure, and then again, not to mention, where am I getting this data, how am I authorizing it, and who can look at it and when. Really, this diagram, which was courtesy of SailPoint, was really designed to help us understand, all the different permutations that might exist, whether it be in a government agency, Fortune 500 or an SMB account that's looking to leverage the web. It's really, you know, the goodness is that we've got answers, the three of us, and really the industry is going that way to solve the problems across all the spectrums. So.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Chris. And you know, what we hear from customers is they want to automate some of these integrations or these processes, and not just operate all of those security products that you had on that one investment slide. You don't want to operate them all in silos, because that doesn't scale either.
Exactly. So I know we only have a minute or two left. Kathy, do you have any questions, or been any questions that we could maybe hit on in the next 2 minutes or so that might be relevant?
Yeah, I have those, Chris.
You have them.
So yeah, there's just a couple quick questions about the recording. Yes, there will be a recording, and it'll be posted. So you'll see that either today or tomorrow. So no issue there. There was a question for Frank, just a product question, whether the predictive identity product was, or any of the SailPoint offerings that were SaaS offerings or deployed in data centers.
Yeah, absolutely. So the SailPoint platform, all the predictive identity services are SaaS offerings. We do have our SaaS identity governance platform, Identity Now. And then we also have our on-prem or cloud infrastructure deployed software platform, Identity IQ. So depending on your organization, we can deploy in a hybrid environment or all true SaaS.
Okay, great. And Frank, there was a question about the contextual attributes that you and I spoke of. And so the question here is, you know, where do they come from? So when I described the data definitions that we're getting from SailPoint, I wasn't speaking of the actual data about the users, but rather the definitions, or the metadata about that information. So the role names, you know, manager, employee, contractor, what type of record is that? Is that an integer, or is that a string? And what are the allowed values? That's the information that I was speaking of, that we get from the SailPoint governance system. And then at runtime, where does that attribute data come from? The actual information, well, it comes from the user session, you know, how they logged in. The subject ID is included when they're attempting some access attempt. And there might be, say, a JSON web token or some other token associated with their authentication. And then we can also connect to attribute sources to look up additional information if that's required to evaluate the policy. So that's where we would connect to a directory, you know, Active Directory, or a database, or a virtual directory service or federation service like Gradient Logic at runtime. So there's the definition of the data from SailPoint, but then the actual at runtime retrieving the data from the session and from user sources.
Yeah, and just to expand on that a little, I mean, typically what we see, take the federal civilian agencies that are part of the continuous diagnostics and mitigation program. They're bringing in background investigation information, they're bringing credential information in, learning management information, personnel management data. So this data comes from across the organization. It may not be an actual application that a user interacts with, but it's data that we use to build an identity profile. And then we can use our identity synchronization automation tools to provision that data, as Jerry said, to an enterprise directory, or even you know, out to a virtual directory or something of that matter, so the data can be consumed by Axiomatics or Exabeam even. So it's all about building the identity profile. The more data we have, we can use that data in policies and in role assignments and things like that. So it really is, like we said it when we started, this is a team sport. And there's a lot of stakeholders, a lot of data that is important to the identity ecosystem for various uses.
Right. And then maybe we can touch on one more question here before finishing up. And we'll start with you, Chris. So I think there was mention of human identities quite a bit. What about non-person identities, robotic processes or other processes? How is that incorporated into the Exabeam model?
Yeah, really great question, and I think it bridges the IoT OT paradigm we're facing these days. So Exabeam has a component called Entity Analytics that really looks at the IT assets, the typical assets in a normal enterprise. But we've chosen to partner with some industry best and to start, and then going to be working with lots of other people to really sort of address the tens of thousands of Internet of Things devices that exist, as well as the operational technologies like SCADA systems. As those become more modernized and more networked, we are working actively with some partnerships there. We announced last week one with Armis, and spoiler alert, we're going to be doing one with an OT vendor next month to announce really a greater coverage. So if you're a government entity that cares about healthcare or power and grid and that type of stuff, we've decided that we're very good at analytics and we're very good with data being fed to us. So we're working with industry power players to bring us really great information that we can incorporate so you can have a holistic risk view, not only the people, but also the entities and also the IoT and the OT elements that would be of a huge concern for you as you look at what the risk vector is for you.
Excellent. Well, Chris, Frank, I think we should wrap it up there. Thank the audience for joining us today. It was great to do the session with the two of you. I really enjoyed it, addressing some of these challenges for our customers. And we welcome anyone that has any additional questions to please send it out to us, and we're happy to follow up. Thanks so much, everyone.
Take care, all. Be safe.
Thank you very much, everyone.